This is Jamie Drummond for Good Food Revolution. I'm sitting here at Le Select Bistro in Toronto with none other than Brewmaster Dougal Sharp, who I recently discovered actually went to high school with me. How are you today, Dougal?
I'm good, thanks, Jamie. How are you?
I'm very well. Now, how are you enjoying Toronto on this trip?
Loving it.
Excellent.
I always love coming to Canada, and I always come to Toronto first, so great fun. And the thing about Canada is everyone makes me feel so welcome out here, so it's a great place to come. We've got lots of business in Canada, so wonderful to be back.
Now, for those people who are unfamiliar with your brews, please explain a little bit about your family's connection to the beer industry and how Innis and Gunn came about.
Well, we started Innis and Gunn back in 2000, and we launched the brand in 2003 in the UK, and we launched it in Canada in 2005. But it wasn't really then that brewing started in my DNA. I started when I was 14 years old at our family brewery in Edinburgh, which was Caledonian, and at that time I was at school and I was employed in my summer holidays to sweep floors and roll barrels and fill barrels and paint walls and just do general dog's body stuff.
Now, how long had Caledonian Brewery been around for at that time? It was quite an established brewery.
The brewery itself was 100 years old at that point, possibly more. It was built in 1869. But Dad had led a management buyout of the company in 1987 because the former owner had decided to shut it down and transfer the production of the beers that it was making down south. So Dad led a management buyout, and that's how I ended up doing all these dog's body jobs in my school holidays. But I stuck at that, and I sort of worked my way up from rolling barrels and sweeping floors to going out in the delivery lorries and adding finings to casks of beer and conditioning cellars. And eventually, by the time I was at university, on the holidays from uni, I continued working at the brewery, and so I ended up in the brew house actually making beer physically, standing at the mash tuns and the coppers, adding the hops, cooling it, putting it into the fermentation vessels. And as all that was happening, the company, which was by then an independent company after the management buyout, the sales were growing, and interest in that type of craft beer, cask ale, as it's called, was growing in the UK, particularly in Scotland. So it was very exciting and great fun for us to be at the forefront of that. And then, just as I was finishing my studies, the brewery burned down. And although I had no real intention of going into the industry, I got a phone call from Dad about 6 months after the fire, and he said, "Look, the technical manager's quit. We're about to start the rebuild. Can you come in and help me out? Just for 6 months, say." I'd started on an environmental chemistry course, but binned it to go and help Dad rebuild. And this was me in a completely different role. I started to really enjoy it, and then after that 6 months was up, Dad gave me a file with brewing written on the front, and he said, "Why don't you get into this? Just why don't you learn a bit?" So at first I didn't quite know what to think about that. But
actually, I have an interjection here. We went to the same school, and I think that your year would have gone through a thing called JigCal before.
Yeah.
Which was basically a very, very old school computer, and you answered a certain number of questions, and it gave you a number of career opportunities. At the very top of that list for me was brewer.
No.
I'm very serious, which is interesting because of what I ended up doing and getting into wine, and always that consideration of making my own wine at some point. So the whole biochemistry angle and things like that. So
the top of my list was sommelier. What about that? No, I'm only kidding. I can't remember. Probably hairdresser or something like that.
Really?
Why
did you have leanings that way at that point?
No.
Right.
I can't remember what that thing's about. It was ridiculous though, because I can remember it. And it was ridiculous.
And they touted it as being sort of the crazy piece of technology.
Yeah. It was cutting edge.
Anyway, back.
Run on steam. But so I hit the books hard and sort of begun to to build my knowledge of the brewing process and build up an understanding of raw materials. And I think it's there because I've always loved cooking, and obviously when you cook, you need to have an interest in the things that you use, the raw materials, the ingredients. So that sort of translated into my approach to brewing. So I was always interested in what we were putting in and in ways that we could improve the quality of our materials. And the end result of doing that was always the intention to try and improve the quality of the beers that we're producing.
Now, how did the profile of the Caledonian, the portfolio, change while you were there?
Portfolio changed really because of the way that consumers were behaving in pubs. And so we started out with much darker beers in sort of popular demand, and by the time I left the brewery in 2002, the darker beers had almost died out completely.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
In favour of lighter, far hoppier, arguably English style beers, and our core brand to satisfy that consumer demand was called Duker's IPA.
Because originally it would have been a higher malt sort of quotient in the beers from Scotland, because we don't grow hops in Scotland.
We don't, no.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, obviously being canny Scots, any traditional brewer would seek to minimise the amount of cost, and hops are costly.
Yes.
Especially
with the kind of the transportation, historically it would have cost a lot to transport stuff up to Scotland to make a hoppy beer.
So beers were always fairly malty. The other big question about why that might have been is that very often in Scotland beer was drunk in a format called a half and half, and that was you would have a half pint of this sweet malty beer and a nip of whiskey.
I've not seen that for a long time. I can remember seeing people drinking it. Yeah.
I mean, it's a tradition that doesn't really exist now, but I think it was certainly evident back then, but in the decline. And obviously, with whiskey production technology having moved on a lot recently, in recent years, the whiskies that were being consumed back then in that format would have been very rough and fiery. And so, a nice sweet malty beer would help to put that sort of fiery heat out once you drunk the whiskey. So there is that whole history to Scottish beer drinking, but when we started to produce Duker's IPA, it became very popular very quickly.
Now, you have to tell me the secret of Innis and Gunn and how it came about.
Well, it was another intervention of fate. It's like the fire. Pulled me into the brewing industry.
Thank you very much for assisting grabbing my pint there.
Yeah, we had been asked by a big distillery company called William Grant's to produce an ale-finished whiskey, and they needed beer to season the inside of barrels, which would then be used to finish the whiskey in the same way as you get sherry finishes and port finishes and all the rest of it. But the interesting thing about that was that other brewers and distillers had tried to do this process in the past and it hadn't really worked out. So we looked at what we knew worked already from the whisky industry and things like sherry and ports, sauternes, all quite common finishes in whisky nowadays. And the one common thing that all of those finishes have is that the liquid that the barrel has in it first is quite sweet and full flavoured. So we invented a sweet, full flavoured beer. We sold that to Grant, so they put it into these oak barrels, and once they had deemed the beer to have soaked into those oak barrels, they would take this stuff out, put mature whiskey in and finish it. The whiskey would absorb this character. And luckily the process worked. For the first time it worked. And they were really pleased with the results. Whiskey had a lovely, sweet, malty taste as a result of this finishing. And so they decided to launch ale cask reserve whiskey. And so they started ordering huge quantities of beer from us. and we would send it off in road tankers to them, and they would fill it. And once the beer had been used in this process, it was regarded as a byproduct, and so they would just throw it away. And
This was in Scotland?
yeah,
And they would just throw the beer away?
hard to believe, but it was part of a production process, and it was a byproduct. It had done its job, and once that had been completed, it was surplus. So beer was being thrown away, except actually what was happening was the people who were supposed to be throwing it away weren't throwing it away, they were actually drinking it, or at least trying to drink as much as they could. And finally, or eventually, it got back to distillery management, and because the workers were saying, this stuff is delicious and it's really too good to throw away. And so the Grants contacted me at the brewery in Edinburgh and said, "You're not going to believe this, but this beer that you've been selling to us, that we've been just throwing away, has just been completely transformed by its time in the oak." And it wasn't something that we thought about. So we ended up getting a sample back to the brewery, put it on our taste panel, and everyone rated it 9 out of 9. And that had never happened in our company's history before. And that is despite the fact that at that point we were brewing the champion beer of Britain.
The Dukers.
Dukers went on to win that year Champion Beer of Britain. And that Champion Beer of Britain winning batch didn't get 9 out of 9 from everyone. This stuff did. And I just said, right, there's something in this. I can remember it like yesterday, because it was so delicious and so unlike anything that I'd ever tried before, that I felt hugely passionate about it. So I said to our family company, we should do something with this. They weren't interested. So I thought, well, I'm not going to let this slip. So I went to speak to Grants and I said, you guys should do something with this. It is their beer after when they bought it from us. I said, you should do something. And they thanked me and they said, yeah, okay, we'll think about that. But of course, Grants was a spirits company and not a beer company. And so I was then, in the June of 2002, leaving to go and do an MBA in France. And on my last day, I sent out an email thanking all those people that I'd worked with, one of whom was the business development director at Grants. And she phoned me up and she said, look, I know you've got a couple of months off before you start your MBA. Why don't you come and talk to us about what you do with this beer? And I thought, brilliant, I'd love to do that. So I did a presentation to their executive board in Edinburgh, and I outlined some of the ideas that I had and the things that they could think about doing with the beer. And 2 weeks later, the chief exec flew back up to Scotland and said, okay, let's just do it. Let's get on with it. How much money do you need? And let's set up a joint venture. We'll put in all the money, and you just get on and build this brand.
Now, how would our viewers find out a little bit more about Innis and Gunn? I've heard your website is about to be updated for the first time in 2 years. So.
Well, yeah, it's. I think
you've been concentrating on making beer, I think.
We've been busy with lots of other infrastructure projects this year, trying to sort of develop the capabilities of the business. But the website will be updated from its current version, which I think was done by Noah just after he left the Ark. So, we're going to update that, and there's lots of stuff online. We do regular releases through the LCBO of different expressions of our beer. So obviously we've got Highland Cask coming out, which has been matured in 21-year-old Speyside malt whisky barrels. It's a limited release in the LCBO. We've got winter beer coming as part of a gift pack later on towards Christmas. So there's lots of stuff going on around the brand in Canada. We've got Nick, brand ambassador and brand manager, who actually lives and works in Canada, who works for us but works within our distributor. So
who's a fine Scottish fellow from Fife, I believe.
He is. Yeah. So we took the unusual step for a beer company of actually sending somebody out to market, because it's such an important market for us.
Well, thank you very, very much, Dougal. I really appreciate you spending some time with us today at the Select, and speaking about Innis and Gunn beer, and delivering that epiphany that I had last night. We hope to catch up with you in Edinburgh sometime soon.
Hope so. Thanks, Jim.
Bye-bye.
give up.